Jerry. There we go.
Thank you so
Lovely,
much.
thanks very much. Have a nice day. There is a good reason why many people avoid these older, smaller sensor cameras, especially models as old as this Lumix G2. But for those on the hunt for a budget-friendly travel or street photography camera, there are a few workarounds so you can still get great images from older cameras just like this. The first hurdle that you're going to need to jump across comes from these older 4/3 sensors. And that is the lack of dynamic range. And that is our ability to expose both for the shadows and for the highlights simultaneously. This might sound easy, but for older cameras like this, you need to know a trick or two. An example of poor dynamic range looks like this. You can see in these images that the highlights are clipping quite easily, which means we can't retain any detail from those brighter spots. Now, this is typically down to the photographer. Brackets, I'm rubbish at photography. But what if I told you that in each of these images I was perfectly exposed with my metering saying I was at 0,0. I wasn't slightly overexposed or slightly underexposed, but still we're seeing some highlight clipping. So what can we do about this? When it comes to editing your digital photos in either Adobe Lightroom or Capture One, it's much easier to retain details in the shadows than it is to rescue details from the highlights. As you can see in this image here, we're able to lift the shadows a little bit and recover some details. Whereas these highlights, well, they're gone like Donkey Kong. So there's a simple solution to prevent this from happening, to help us retain those details in our highlights. If we're in manual mode, instead of trying to expose perfectly in the middle at 0,0, instead underexpose by 0.5 to 1 full stop. Likewise, if you're shooting in auto ISO or aperture priority or shutter priority mode, you can actually just set your exposure compensation to -0.5 or -1 full stop, and the camera will do all of that for you. With these adjustments made, you can see that we're able to preserve the details in the highlights much better and create more balanced exposure in our images. However, there will be times where you need to choose between exposing for your highlights or for your shadows. Taking these shots as an example, here the main focus of the shot is the silhouette, so there's not really a reason to expose for the shadows. Really, we want the shape of the silhouette more than we want the details of the subject. So here it's much better to expose for the highlights and let the shadows fall off. This issue of poor dynamic range on the G2 was actually really surprising to me. Almost as surprising as finding out that only 11.9% of you watching my channel are actually subscribed. Did you know that you can subscribe and it costs you nothing, but it helps out the channel an awful lot? So why not hit the subscribe button? And, you know, we can also move on to this next point about the autofocus and how to cope with this terrible autofocus on the G2. Autofocus on older cameras like these is notoriously hit and miss. When we set into AFC, which means autofocus continuous, we can suddenly see a lot of pulsing, both on stationary subjects and on moving subjects. And sadly, this means that even when your AF point is perfectly on your subject and you're following them, taking a few shots, while it's meant to be focusing continuously, some of the pulsing results in missing focus completely. When it comes to compensating for poor autofocus in AFC modes on these older cameras, the solution might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but in my testing, this has been the most reliable. Rather than shooting in AFC, instead it's actually better to shoot in AFS. And instead of trying to shoot with an f1.7 aperture, stop down to something like 3.2. The reason we go into AFS is actually to reduce the likelihood of this unwanted pulsing, which can lead to us missing focus when the camera is still trying to decide what it's focusing on when you press the shutter. And the reason that we stop down from 1.7 to say 3.2 is so that we increase our depth of field to include more in focus. So even if our autofocus point slightly misses, we're getting a little bit more in focus, so hopefully our images are still sharp. This problem with continuous autofocus is really only for fast moving subjects. So when you're shooting the majority of subjects you're going to see that are not moving as fast, AFS is always going to be useful. But sometimes if you're shooting fast moving people or even dogs, you need a workaround for this problem.
Leave it.
Perfect.
Good boy.
Good trick. Well played. You can see from these images that I shot of Ralph here that I actually stopped down to f3.2 on this 1.7 lens. Ralph, even though he looks like he was sitting still in this final shot, you can see he was actually moving around quite a lot, so me and his owner were trying to kind of get him to pose in the right way. So stepping down to f3.2 meant that my depth of field was a bit deeper, which meant that I could compensate for him moving or the autofocus not quite hitting him. Whereas on the 3 dogs that I showed previously who were walking towards me, I was on AFC and I was at f1.7. So kind of the worst of both worlds. And there's really only a couple of shots which are passably in focus on any of the dogs, but for the most part they've all ended up just being soft across the board. Or across the bork. When we use a prime lens like this 25mm f1.7 over the kit lens, which is a 14-42 f3.5 to 5.6, we lose flexibility in terms of focal lengths, but we also gain some flexibility and lens characteristics in having a wider aperture. With the f1.7 aperture, we can start to experiment with shallow depth of field in more of our images, which wasn't really as easy with the kit lens. However, as you're about to see, not all f1.7 lenses are created equal.
I first want to compare just this G2 with the 4/3 sensor with a full frame camera. So we're just going to do a very simple depth of field test. I'm not going to go and shoot anything specific. We're just going to use these flowers here just to sort of show that depth of field in the background. So we can see we get like a pleasing amount of bokeh when we're actually all the way at f1.7 and, you know, increasing the distance between our subject and the background. That's what's going to kind of enhance that effect. So that's something you need to bear in mind when you're shooting with a smaller sensor camera like this. You're not going to be able to get amazing bokeh at a longer distance, which I'll just show you now. So taking a few steps away, immediately the depth of field effect has kind of fallen off. So now we're going to compare this with a full frame camera at the same aperture value and then at the same equivalent aperture. Because remember, this aperture has a crop factor of 2. So it's actually a 3.4 aperture. So we're going to get as close to that as we can with a 3.5 on a full frame. Also, sneak peek, this is probably going to be in next week's video as well. You might have seen this on Instagram the other day, but I'm loaning an R5 from Canon, so thank you, Canon. But it's chunky, to say the least. So to match the f-stop of the Lumix 25 1.7, I'm going down to f1.8. So you'll see that effect is dramatic in comparison. And then likewise, we'll go from a little bit further away on here as well. Similar sort of distance that we were at before, but the 1.8 on here, we're still getting like a not super dramatic shallow depth of field, but much more noticeable than what we just saw on the Lumix G2. Finally, what we're going to do is we're going to match the depth of field. So we have the option of 3.2 or 3.5. I'm going to go to f3.5, which this then creates the same equivalent depth of field as the Micro Four Thirds 1.7. So this is now taking into consideration the difference in depth of field between sensor sizes, and from the image previews that we're seeing, we can straight away see that that depth of field effect is like dramatically reduced. And then we'll go from further away, and hopefully with this comparison we should see pretty much the same effect that we saw on the G2, which really shouldn't be an awful lot between the subject and the background. Again, not super like interesting shots, just sort of show you that difference in depth of field.
You may have noticed that some of these images look a little bit different to the straight out of camera raw files that we saw earlier. And that's because I edited each of these with my preset packs. And did you know that you can get all 3 of my preset packs together and save with the 3-pack bundle? And exclusively for viewers of this video, you can save a further 20% by using this code at checkout. But be quick, because it's actually only valid for the first 7 days of this video being live. So you don't want to miss out. This G2 is the most affordable gateway camera into the Micro Four Thirds system, but I agree, it's not the prettiest option. Micro Four Thirds has a lot of attractive cameras. The G2, sadly, is not one of them. So you might be considering an improvement, a slight step up in terms of specs, but also a more attractive camera that you can show off on the streets. And I've talked about several of these cameras in the past, from the GX1, the GX7, the GM1 that I lent for a day, the Olympus OMD EM10 Mark I, and the Lumix GX80. Each of these cameras vary in price on the used market, but for a couple of $100 more, you can get a significant increase in specs compared to the G2. And to be honest, the main increase you're going to see is going to be a little bit of sensor resolution and improved autofocus performance. But as someone who has tested each of these cameras that I've mentioned, my top two recommendations would be the Lumix GX80 and the Olympus OMD EM10 Mark I, which I still think is an absolute steal for what it's still going for on the used market. Specifically the Lumix GX80, I think this was the most balanced camera I've used in terms of the Micro Four Thirds system. It was as pocketable as the GX1 in my opinion, but it had the flexibility that I liked from the OMD EM10. It had the built-in EVF that really slotted in with that rangefinder design, and it also had the tilting LCD. I actually did a whole 2 videos on this camera, but the first one you can watch right here. Really worth taking a look. It's not too much more expensive than this G2, and it's a cult classic for a reason.